In 1922, in New York City, writers and editors formed PEN America, imagining that writers engaging writers globally could bridge the divide between nations and cultures.
To say that a new barbarism threatens is to say too much.
Hitler burnt books and used a phrase that's very interesting. He said, we have to get rid of the artistic criminal.
In Spain, fascists arrested journalist Arthur Koestler and executed poet Federico Garcia Lorca. In Germany, Nazis arrested, imprisoned, exiled, and murdered writers and intellectuals.
Barbarism is not an episode. It is a powerful thread running evil through history.
We work on the unspoken premise that the freedom to write is one of the inalienable rights of humankind. We are passionate about improving the liberty of writers everywhere.
PEN stands for the principle of unhampered transmission of thought, and members pledge themselves to oppose suppression of free expression around the world.
And the enemies of the imagination, politburos, ayatollahs, all the different goon squads of gods in power, want to shut these revolutions down and can't.
Behind the Iron Curtain, Václav Havel and dozens of other writers were imprisoned for writing and signing the Charter 77 Human Rights Manifesto. And in Nigeria, playwright Ken Saro-Wiwa was arrested, tortured, and hanged. In China, Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo was condemned to prison for 11 years for writing 7 sentences. And in Ukraine, filmmaker Oleg Sentsov criticized the Russian government and was sent to a Siberian prison camp.
A writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind. A writer's life and work are its necessity.
Over the past 100 years, PEN America has become an international force, advocating for free expression, defending writers and artists at risk around the globe, and fighting censorship here and abroad.
To be an artist, you must imagine and create and world build. And to be an activist, you must do the same, because an activist has to imagine a world that isn't there and make it so.
At PEN America, we are fighting for free expression in all its forms. Novels, nonfiction, poetry, dance, film, art, theater, cartoons, music, research, digital activism, journalism, and translations. Because creativity freely expressed transcends borders and drives our curiosity. It's how we share experiences, tell stories, and understand others. Free expression is the lifeblood of our freedom and humanity. It's what unites us.
For PEN as an organization, it should be heartening to realize that it turns out the pen is mightier than the sword. The stories we tell are powerful.
PEN America, championing the freedom to write for 100 years. With you, we're ready for the next century.
Please welcome CEO of PEN America, Suzanne Nossel.
Hello, welcome to PEN America's Centennial Symposium, Words on Fire, Writing, Freedom, and the Future. This is a historic gathering of writers, readers, supporters, and leaders of PEN America, past, present, and I hope future. Our audience is as, if not more distinguished as our lineup on stage. We're here to celebrate this remarkable milestone and take stock of our shared mission in defense of the freedom to write. But of course, this event is not as envisioned just a few weeks ago. When we contemplated how to emblemize 100 years of PEN America, the first author to come to mind was Salman Rushdie. There's no one whose life experience and ethos is more closely entwined with our organization. When the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa targeting Salman, his murderous decree offered a twisted testament to the influence of writers and the lengths to which governments will go to silence them. Our intention had been for Salman to be in conversation with our president, Akhtar, discussing the literary community's mobilization behind the satanic verses and what that epoch portended for the threats to free expression today. That plan, of course, was sliced to shreds by a man with a knife on stage in upstate New York. But rather than shattering our agenda or deterring our purpose, the attack on Salman further crystallized what we were trying to do and why. This latest assault was among the most personal and heartrending of the cataclysmic events that have jolted PEN America over time, repeatedly reminding us of the fragility of our freedom. The exhibition on view just outside these doors, PEN America at 100, curated by Bridget Coleman and Lisa Kolasek, recounts our history as a series of shocks to the system. The trauma of World War I spurred writers to unite. At a time when international systems were being reimagined in an effort to lock the barn doors for fear of further unspeakable horrors, writers were convinced that they too had a role to play in averting man-made calamities, that treaties, institutions, boundaries, monuments, and memorials might not be enough to prevent future ruptures, that writing, reading, debate, analysis, theorizing, and storytelling could help navigate humanity around the deepest, darkest sinkholes, that a worldwide web of writers connected by shared values of curiosity, respect for the written word, and freedom of speech could provide a kind of safety net or buffer zone wherein some of humanity's worst tendencies might be tempered. But dinners and dialogue, which is how PEN began, were no match for the task. The Nazi rise forced PEN to become a more overtly political organization, mobilizing in defense of writers facing annihilation. During the McCarthy era, writers and creators were targeted by unhinged fear-mongering. The Iron Curtain shrouded both writers and readers, stifling expression and rendering dissidents martyrs. Each gut punch was a reminder of why PEN America existed and an impetus to deepen our work, take more risks, build greater support, and raise our voice louder. There was and is no playbook for how to go about this work. PEN mostly invented it and has evolved it over time. We've made it to our 100th birthday, a rare feat among organizations of this kind, not because of an endowment, a single overarching benefactor, or a building. We have none of those. We have done it on the power of our mission and our members. Our bedrock has always been an extraordinary collective of those who treasure books and words. It encompasses decorated luminaries, working writers, aspiring authors, journalists, editors, literary curators, publishers, translators, script and screenwriters, as well as legions of readers who rally around them. Every generation of PEN America writers picks up the pen of their forebears to write the next chapter. Our board of trustees has gone from Albee to Bashevis Singer to Ellison to Buck to Updike, Bellow, Miller, Mailer, Sontag, Rushdie, Egan, Akhtar, and many more in between. The premise of PEN is that these standard bearers share something beyond an avocation, profession, or even passion, that they collectively stand for something, that they are a community. We celebrate one another, including literary giants whose prose and poetry manifest the best of what free expression has to offer, and bracing new voices who are reshaping the canon. Those celebrations and that sense of collective knit the fabric of a mutual dependence. In a polity comprised of opposing camps, we are determined to remain a big tent organization. We don't agree on everything. Sometimes it feels as though we may not agree on much. But what we do agree on is that when the police knock on the door, the sentence is handed down, or the book is banned, fellow writers and readers will speak out, campaign, rail, and rage until justice is done. When the knife is plunged in, they know they must rush the stage, subdue the attacker, and save the writer. The pressures on our mission demand that we do more than just react or bear witness. Our community of writers is impetus and megaphone for the hard work of understanding and meeting unprecedented threats to free expression with not just words, but action. This is the daily work of PEN America, now carried out by a staff of almost 75 professionals, 10 chapters nationwide, offices in New York, Washington, and Los Angeles, 7,500 members, and colleague PEN organizations worldwide. We are known and sought out for our research, our campaigns, our experts, our events, and our ideas. We are the national leader in documenting the rise of book bans and gag orders on curriculum, driving the conversation about how vague notions of patriotism and parents' rights have become cover for censorship. We call out violations of free speech from the right and the left, working with colleges and universities to ensure that the imperative of further open education for all people does not mean closing it off to certain ideas. We've done groundbreaking work to build global recognition of online harassment and disinformation as threats to free expression. We work to dismantle the barriers to expression, giving voice and opportunity to writers who are incarcerated, undocumented, or otherwise locked out of the literary community. Because free expression is more than the right to say your piece. It's the opportunity to be heard, to persuade, win adherence, give, take, refine, and advance your truth. A discourse that is so polluted by vitriol and falsehood that the public tunes out is one in which the power of writing atrophies. A polity so ossified into orthodoxies that people refuse to hear out as opposing perspectives is one that thwarts the power of reason and evidence. Both around the globe and right here at home, we are in a world in which words risk losing their potency, where lying carries no stigma and truth is lost in the cacophony, mistaken for yet another dose of cheap punditry. A world where people are being taught to avert their eyes, cover their ears, and close their minds to avoid that which threatens, unsettles, or contradicts. Today, we celebrate PEN America's centennial, but also set course for the next 100 years. If we've learned anything in our first century, it's that our founding writers were correct in thinking that the tools of statecraft and the work of governments would not suffice to safeguard what is sacred and just in society, that politicians, legislators, lawyers, and judges cannot be the only bulwarks against the forces that silence and suppress, for they too can succumb. Writers and thinkers must see themselves as stewards of social order, champions of conscience, and duty-bound to rise in defense of open discourse. We launch into a new century, determined to meet the moment, but also cognizant that the challenges ahead are bigger than all of us. We will need new inspiration, original ideas, and revamped ways of seeing the world. Who better to provide that than writers? That's why today we've gathered some of the most defiant, prophetic minds of our literary era to help us think, see, and understand what lies before us. When we walk out tonight, may we embark on a new century for PEN America with our energies redoubled, our resolve intact, our solidarity renewed, and our fervor ignited. That's what PEN America's founding purpose, our history, and our shared future deserve and demand. Thank you.
Please welcome longtime supporter of PEN America and award-winning international author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie.
Hello, thank you. It's very lovely to be here, to be part of this. I sometimes joke in the way that one tells a joke that isn't really just a joke, that I'm very grateful for PEN America, because if the Nigerian government were ever to throw me into jail for something that I said or wrote, then PEN would be there to get me out, even if it meant organizing a jailbreak. PEN America's work, PEN America's existence is in many ways an assurance that writers all over the world can, perhaps even should, dare to speak. And Dare to Speak happens to be the title of Suzanne Nossel's book. And I want to thank Suzanne, who is a source of inspiration for me, for her unfussy and tireless dedication to PEN. So after the attack on Salman Rushdie, I could not stop thinking about it. The brutal and barbaric intimacy of a person standing inches from you and forcefully plunging a knife into your flesh. And this because you wrote. I decided to reread Salman's books, and reading became not only an act of defiant support, but an act of meaning. It was important for me to remind myself how much words matter, how much books matter. In Salman's memoir, Joseph Anton, he writes about an Egyptian sheikh who said that if the Egyptian writer, Naguib Mahfouz, had been properly punished for writing his novel, then Salman Rushdie would not have dared write his. And shortly afterwards, one of the sheikh's followers stabbed Naguib Mahfouz in the neck. Salman then writes, the elderly novelist survived, fortunately. And that line, the elderly novelist survived, fortunately, felt particularly poignant and moving to me. Salman survived, but what happened to him should never have happened. And while we insist that violence can never, ever be an acceptable response to speech, we must also not deny the power of words to wound. Words can wound our spirits. Some of the greatest hurts of my life have come from words that somebody said or wrote. And some of the most beautiful gifts I have received have also been words. Yes, words have power, and it is in fact because of their power that we must protect them. I think of all the times I have learned new things, let go of old beliefs, and broadened my worldview because speech was free. If we stifle speech, we stifle the possibility of learning. The man who stabbed Salman forgets that there are many brilliant intellectuals who disagree with Salman and who can write back. As the British journalist Kenan Malik put it so well, what is sometimes deemed an offense to a community is more often a debate within communities. So I sometimes joke, yet another joke that really isn't just a joke, that I say I'm very interested in the ideas of people who disagree with me because I believe very nobly that it is good to hear different sides of an issue. But actually, the truth is that I'm interested in their ideas because I want to understand them and therefore be better able to demolish them. We must protect the values of disagreement and agree that there is value in disagreement. It troubles me nowadays how quickly people are fired for something they have said. Not because I like or support what they say, I often don't, but because it is a silencing that leads to a larger kind of silencing. The act of firing a person without engaging with what was said, sometimes without even saying exactly what was said, almost suggests that what was said has a certain power, if not truth, which then leads to reasoning such as this: they would not need to censor us if we were wrong. When I first came to the US to attend college, many years ago, I was struck by what seemed to me a particularly American ideal, the addiction to comfort. This addiction to comfort manifested itself in such things as aesthetically displeasing but supremely comfortable sneakers, drive-through banking, hospital visits where one is constantly asked, "Are you comfortable?" rather than the Nigerian norm of being expected to grit your teeth and get on with it and go through a very painful procedure. So this addiction to comfort is harmlessly convenient, even desirable in many cases, but often leads to a kind of silencing in public discourse. I grew up in Nigeria under the military governments of Generals Buhari and Babangida, and I remember stories of journalists being jailed, beaten, killed. I remember my parents and their friends on the campus of the University of Nigeria talking about politics in hushed voices, even though they were in our living room. But only until I came to the US did I become so attuned to a very rigid idea of how you should say things and how not to say things in public discourse. I learned that in conversations about America's difficult subjects, like race, like income inequality, the goal is not truth, the goal is comfort. Comfort for all, ostensibly, but in reality, comfort for the most powerful. I learned that the fear of causing offense, the fear of ruffling the careful layers of comfort, can become a kind of fetish. Things are left unsaid, questions go unasked, and because questions go unasked, ignorance festers. Many American universities are well-meaning in wanting to keep students comfortable, but they do so, I think, at the risk of not just creating an insular, closed space, but one where it is almost impossible to admit to ignorance. And in my opinion, the ability to admit to ignorance is a wonderful thing because it creates an opportunity to learn. Even the literary world is addicted to comfort. I have never understood why it is considered valid criticism in this country to discredit a piece of literature for not having something called redemption. I like redemption as much as anyone else, but this insistence on comfort, which H.L. Mencken wonderfully called the cult of hope, can sometimes become an obstacle to truth-telling and therefore becomes its own kind of speech suppression. There used to be a general tendency in the United States to think of censorship as an essentially foreign problem. And this even after the US Supreme Court decided in Citizens United that money is speech. And if a country decides that money is speech, then really true speech is dead. But this was because dramatic kinds of censorship were not in the political mainstream. Now they are, especially with the ongoing hysterical efforts to ban books. And Dave Eggers recently wrote a very insightful piece in the Washington Post about all of the inherent contradictions of this movement. But the censorship that most matters to me is the censorship that is not to do with the reading of books, but is to do with the writing of books. Literature is the love of my life. I'm most alive when I'm writing fiction. And there is, I think, no other human endeavor that requires freedom as much as creativity does. To create, one needs a kind of formless roving of the mind to go nowhere and anywhere and everywhere. And it is from that swirl that characters and worlds emerge. Many writers in this country today are not able to create fully because they are drowning in self-censorship. Self-censorship is not the sort of thing that one can do a public show of hands about, or I would have done it here. Shall we? No. We may not be able to measure this self-censorship objectively, but we can deduce it from the books we read, from how books are read, and of course, from social media. In America today, orthodoxies have become religions, and these orthodoxies are enforced brutally. Books increasingly are read not as art, but as politics. Characters are absurdly expected to be ideologically pure, as if any real person in the world is ideologically pure. It feels to me as though we are now expected to speak of the ugly sides of human nature as though we are ourselves inherently incapable of any ugliness. And because we are unwilling to recognize within ourselves the possibility of what horrifies us, it leads to self-censorship. Sometimes we are afraid to speak because we are tribal and our views do not align with those of our tribe. It is true that speech is very much about power, but it is also true that social media has reshaped that power dynamic. There is, around creating, a climate of fear and a reluctance to acknowledge that fear. Because there are huge costs, social costs and emotional costs to writing and storytelling. And it is unfair and perhaps too simplistic to ask individual writers to just take on the cloak of courage and plow on. We have to create a better enabling environment for writers to write. And I thank PEN America for its work on this issue. My experience with self-censorship is shaped by my different selves. In my personal life, I often censor myself from love. Some family members do not believe what I believe, and I don't believe what they believe, but we love each other. And in certain conversations, I choose silence because I ask myself, what's the intent? What will I achieve by speaking? In my life as a citizen and as a writer, I am less willing to silence myself because there is so much more at stake. I think the reason behind speech matters. Speaking with the sole intention to provoke feels empty and meaningless to me. I do not at all suggest that our intent must be noble or worthy. I've never done very well with worthiness myself, but that in a humane and deeply felt way, our intention must be true. And it is my belief that storytellers and artists begin with that, a true intention, and the intention to be true. And so here is a question I have been thinking about. Would Salman Rushdie's satanic verses be published today? Possibly not. Would it even be written today? Literature is essential because it reflects us back to ourselves. It tells us how things feel. It goes where other art forms cannot go, the mining of human motivation. It is impossible to create literature in a culture of self-censorship. We end up telling lies, and how can it be lies that we will leave behind for the generations to come? And so as we look forward, we must start again to assume good faith. Yes, some people are not of good faith, which I think is what that modern word troll means. But we cannot, because some people do not act in good faith, then decide that the principle of good faith itself is dead. More voices need to be heard loudly and consistently in favor of conversation. It is time to begin again to demand not just truth, but also nuance. I think, for example, that a nuanced argument for any social justice movement is stronger when it is nuanced. It is also a more confident argument because it does not feel the need to simplify in order to convince. And finally, I would like to end with a very small story. Some years ago, the Nigerian government passed a law that makes it a crime to be gay. An acquaintance of mine supported this law. We had a conversation about it, which got a little bit heated. A while later, he read a short story of mine in which one of the characters was gay. But this character's sexual orientation was not the main thrust of the story. After he read the story, he told me, by the time I realized the character was gay, I already liked him. It's one of the most hopeful things that anyone has ever told me about my work. It reaffirmed my faith in the power of storytelling. Because of a story, this acquaintance of mine saw the humanity of a person whose human rights he had earlier been in support of squashing. Stories matter, and words matter. Thank you.
Please welcome award-winning storytellers and champions of free expression, Margaret Atwood and Dave Eggers.
Hi. How are we doing so far? It's a great honor to be here with you. I'm going to try to find places for all of this stuff. I brought too many things out here. I wanted to, Margaret, I don't know if everybody knows, but you were instrumental in the formation of PEN Canada, and I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about that.
It was just a misunderstanding. So I was in England, and I got a letter. We wrote letters in those days. It was 1984 approx. And they said, would you head up PEN Canada? And I thought there was one. And it turned out that it didn't really yet exist. There had been a PEN in Montreal, and it had contained both English speakers and French speakers, and then the French speakers said that they wanted to have an all-French speaking one, and there were only about 5 English speakers left in Montreal at that time anyway, so they couldn't have one there, and they'd never built it out. There weren't any writers from the rest of Canada. It had been a sort of quite small thing. And I got back finding that that was the case and realized that we would have to build it out ourselves. And at that point, we had some postage stamps. So it was, there was no staff, there were no members, but there were some postage stamps. And we wrote a lot of letters and made a lot of phone calls. And my only interest in doing it, quite frankly, was I didn't want a tea party, but I was interested in the Writers in Prison program, which was not putting writers in prison. It was getting writers out of prisons in other countries. So one of the things that happens in PEN is that you speak for writers in other countries. So I was interested in that, and I said I would do it on that understanding that we would make that our major thing that we were doing. And I raised the money to get actually some money and a staff by writing a book called the Can-Lit Food Book, in which I collected things out of people's novels and poems having to do with eating. And, and then I arranged them like breakfast, morning coffee, lunch, tea, dinners, banquets, and funerals. And we got, and I illustrated it myself because it was cheaper, and we got an agent to agent this and not take a fee, and we actually raised enough money that way to do it. We also collected recipes from writers. Guess what? Some of them can't cook. So, so Michael Ondaatje's recipe was grapefruits. Cut the grapefruit in 2, you make the little sections, and if you wish, you can put a maraschino cherry on. They made me take out the section on cannibalism, the cannibalism recipes. So I had sort of gingerbread men and things like that. So I couldn't put anything actually poisonous into this book.
Well, and not that long after you were, when Salman first made his first North American appearance.
Okay, the story of Salman's first North American appearance. Yes, Canada at that time was a country in which if you took yourself too seriously, you would get pins stuck into you, into your balloon of your ego. And it's still pretty much that way, but we used to put on PEN benefits that were the opposite of that, in which people would do performances, sort of skit-like performances. I once sang Anything You Can Write, I Can Write Better with Roberts and Davies. Neither of us could sing. And Graham said at that time, looking at the ceiling, isn't it interesting how people enjoy watching other people who do one thing fairly well, do another thing quite badly. It was that kind of evening. So we concluded Act 1 with a country and Western trio We had one person who could actually sing and play the guitar, and the other two of us actually couldn't. And we were singing parodies of C&W songs, such as Ghost Writers in the Sky. And we had appropriate outfits on, if I had the wings of an agent, etc. We were backstage taking off our Western gear when, at intermission, when Louise Dennis appeared at the door and said, "Salman Rushdie is here." He had been flown over secretly on a private jet, I still don't know whose, and he was in the building. The place was riddled with Secret Service people talking into their sleeves, and the backstage was locked down. "Oh," said we, "and you, Margaret, are now going to be introducing him in Act 2.
Meaning you.
Me. Yes.
Not me.
You, yes. No. So I said, "No, you're not Margaret Atwood. Yet. You're not."
Boy. I knew I was going to get one of those, yeah.
Yeah. So I said, "Oh, you can't say no, right?" So there we were, and there was Salman. It was his first public appearance in North America. And it was an amazing moment, and standing ovations all around. And the first sort of head of a government appeared on stage with him and said, "You're welcome here." And that would be Bob Ray. So yes, that was that moment. And that was 1992, 30 years ago, if you can imagine that. I look just the same, but I sing even worse.
Were you disappointed in some of the organizations and bodies that did not stand with Salman?
Well, when this happened, Graham was the head of PEN, and he was the only person speaking publicly about this and about the necessity of free speech in a democracy. So, of course, we were pretty worried most of the time. But no churches, no governments, no trade unions, no nothing. They were standing there saying, on the sideline saying, "Good job." But that's what PEN is for. Yeah. And that's why I support it. And it is true that not everybody in it agrees with things that other people in it might say elsewhere, but that's the point. It's not a party line.
You recently, I woke up to find a notice that there was a video of Margaret Atwood directing a flamethrower at her own book, The Handmaid's Tale. And I wonder if you could, has anyone seen this video? Oh, okay, everybody saw it. I'm always a little late to things online.
Not only have they seen it, but 5 billion people around the world have seen it.
5 billion?
Yes.
All right.
It's
Tell us a little bit about the genesis of this. And was this your own flamethrower or was this,
I wish.
You already
No, they made me give
had
it
to
back.
borrow one. All right.
And they also said, I think really unnecessarily, just pointed at the book, Margaret. I said, well, there's some other things I would like to burn down. Yes, so it was a project thought up by a design organization who took it to the publisher, who took it to me, and I said, yes, it sounds great, but it has to be for something. You know, it has to be, and who is it going to be for? So we thought about that, and I said, I think it should be for PEN America, because PEN America has been very much out front on this issue, and it's a very hot button issue in this country. So it could have been PEN Canada, but we don't have quite the same problems here. We have a different form of government. We may get those problems because sooner or later they seep across. You know, they seep over the border. But right now the big problems are here, and PEN has been exemplary in standing up in a thoughtful way. So I said, let's do it for PEN America. So that's why we did it. And the idea was to create an unburnable book, which took them about 5 tries, because their first tries unfortunately caught fire.
Is that true?
Yes.
And then they would go back to the drawing board?
They would go back to the drawing board to get materials that would actually stand up to this. So the covers weren't a problem, it was the bindings, you know, the thing attaching the pages together, that was hard. But they did it just about 24 hours before the show was going to launch, as it were. So yes, we did that, and it's a strong statement.
And the book itself was auctioned for $130,000, I think.
Don't know the exact figure, but it was over 100, and it went to PEN America.
Is the owner of this book here, by any chance? I wouldn't doubt that.
Somebody's got it.
I won't reveal you.
It's one of a kind.
Do you remember when that book was first banned, Handmaid's Tale?
Oh.
It was banned in whole countries, Spain,
Let me
Portugal.
count the ways, yes. Yeah, it was banned under Franco in Spain. It was banned under Salazar in Portugal. And by banned, I mean, it's not just kicked out of a library. I mean, you could not have it in the country. I mean, hide it under the mattress like that. What we used to do with James Joyce's Ulysses. I'm really old. Yeah, back in those days it was dirty words. Dirty words, you couldn't have them in books. Lady Chatterley's Lover. I was there for that trial, I remember it. It's quite funny. And look what happened, the floodgates opened, now you can't get creative swearing anymore. Yes, never mind. So, yeah, so the first Handmaid's Tales in Spanish were published in Argentina, and the first ones in Portuguese were published in Brazil.
Mm. And was that a surprise to you when that happened? And
it's hard to surprise me on those matters because I'm so old.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was born in 1939. What does that tell you? It tells you that for the whole of my childhood, it was World War II. Mm. So what with the Nazis? Big book burners, just saying.
We, I don't know if everybody knows, but, you know, Suzanne alluded to it earlier, but PEN has been tracking book bannings, especially in schools. And the numbers are startling. Last year, about a 9-month period, there were over 1,500 book bans, and this next year that they're finishing up their report, the numbers are far, far worse. And it's an incredibly organized affront. I had a book that Margaret wrote about called The Circle. My book was my first book banning was in South Dakota last year when they banned that for like maybe a page and a half of semi-erotic content. I didn't even know, I had forgotten I'd written it.
There's sex in that
Yeah,
book?
there's sex, yeah.
I missed that.
So I didn't, when I heard it was banned, I couldn't imagine what for because I'd forgotten I'd written these passages. But I went out there and I found that there had been it had been orchestrated ever since Trump visited Mount Rushmore nearby Rapid City in 2019, stirred up a lot of hate, a lot of fear, and also stirred up a lot of organized groups that placed a slate of new board members on the local school board, all of whom sort of touted their Christian bona fides and none of whom had kids in the district. So they elected all 4 of them to take over that school board. And in a way that was like, it blindsided the local community because they figured it's a school board election, nobody pays attention, the voters, it's like 20% turnout. But these folks were much more organized and much more motivated. They put their slate together, they elected them all, and before you knew it, they were banning books. And it just sort of, it demonstrated how, with that kind of motivation, those that would ban books are often more motivated than those, and
so
more organized than
those.
Yeah,
they're motivated so far because people take democracy for granted once they've had it for a while.
Right.
And they think, oh, they're not going to do that. Oh, no, they won't do that. No, nobody does that. And then they do it. Because other people aren't expecting it. So now that they're expecting it, you know, it'll take a while, but people have to live with this situation possibly to find out why they didn't like it in the first place. Yeah. And I think that's going to happen in a lot of places about a lot of issues. Need I mention Roe versus Wade being overturned, and how is that going for you, Texas? Yeah. How's that going for you, Kansas?
The day that Roe was overturned, you posted on Instagram a picture of yourself with a coffee cup that said, "I told you so."
I know, that was wicked. It's misunderstood in some places as gloating. No, it was not gloating, it was simply the truth.
Well, you've also said repeatedly that you've never believed the phrase, "it can't happen here."
I've never believed that.
Yeah.
Nope.
And The Handmaid's Tale was made up of all instances. You also said you didn't make up anything. These were all stitched together from different periods in history
different
where all
times,
of those things
different
happened.
Places, all of those things have happened.
Yeah.
And it's now that we have a lot of digital information on a lot of people, it's much easier to just select people that you want to get rid of. Or suppress, and just get rid of and suppress them, because it's harder to forge. It's harder to forge stuff than it used to be. There's a plus and a minus to that.
Have you been? I mean, you had just published the Testaments in 2019, which was a follow-up, a sequel to *Handmaid's Tale*. And now this happens. How do you react to it? Do you feel like you need to write a new forward to it? I'm sure so many millions have turned to you.
Yeah, I have actually written about it. I did a piece in The Atlantic just at that moment when it got leaked. Yeah. But it's going to be, first of all, it's been quite motivating to people who might not otherwise have bothered to vote in the midterms. It's been quite galvanizing. And even a lot of people who aren't particularly Democrats, but might be independents and might even be Republican women, are against the kinds of total bans that a lot of these places, without even thinking for 2 seconds about it, would like to bring in. And this is, in fact, based on a religious belief. And let us separate out things that are beliefs, things that are facts, and things that are opinions. Opinions can be based on beliefs, or they can be based on facts. So the belief that a group of cells is ensouled, has been given a soul at the moment of conception, is a religious belief, and it's against the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, which says, no state religion and freedom of religion. And why did the people writing the Constitution put that in? Because they had seen several centuries of horrific religious wars in Europe, and they did not want to have those reproduced in the United States. Because there are already a number of different religions there, so they did not want to see warring factions of religions massacring other people. So it is a religious belief, and what you have, therefore, in these states that are enforcing that is the imposition of a religious belief on a lot of people who do not share that religious belief. So there.
In Canada, can you characterize what the elemental differences are where this could not? Because it does.
There is no could not.
You don't think so?
There's no could not, but there's less likely. So when I first published The Handmaid's Tale, the English, who had had their religious civil war in the 17th century, what with the Puritanism and Oliver Cromwell, they said, jolly good yarn. They didn't say, could it happen here? The Canadians, a more nervous group of people, said, could it happen here? And the Americans split. Some of them said, oh, it couldn't happen here. Ha, 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 don't be silly. We've got democracy, etc. And the other half, mostly on the West Coast, said, how long have we got?
Well, you say...
So you know the answer.
In the Testaments, and I think you say in times of extremes, it produces extremists, or...
Of course, yeah. In times of chaos, extremists are produced.
And you cite sort of the environmental factors as one of the reasons that
environmental factors always are disruptive and destabilizing because they affect the food supply. Yeah. So French Revolution starts after years of simmering. Three things happened. Number one, the taxes went up. They were already quite high. Why did they go up? Because the French government had put so much money into helping the American Revolution. It's your fault. Then it was a very hot summer. And third, the price of bread went up. So, you know, the heat, the food supply, the money, very destabilizing. And that's when people think, we don't like the situation, and we don't like it so much that we're going to act on it. So I draw a little circle, and my little circle is a diagram, and up at the top it says totalitarianism, and down at the bottom it says chaos. And through the middle is where you want to be. Let's call it liberal democracy. And there's an arrow going up on the right towards totalitarianism. There's an arrow on the left going up towards totalitarianism, because we've had them of both kinds. There's an arrow going down towards chaos on either side. And there's a great big arrow going from chaos all the way up to totalitarianism and skipping liberal democracy altogether. So if you get enough chaos, the impulse is to say, let's have Mr. Fix-It. And you know, there's always a Mr. Fix-It standing ready. Sometimes it's a Ms. Fix-It, but usually it's a Mr. Fix-It. So that's how it goes, and that's why Mr. Putin was so interested in destabilizing America. Yep. Make some chaos, and then along comes Mr. Fix-It. And what does Mr. Fix-It say? He says, only I can fix it. That's what Mr. Fix-Its say.
Well, there's a great quote of yours that says that it's hard to speak truth to power if there is no truth. So if we're talking about fake news and the destabilization and troll farms coming from Russia, where's the way back? Especially given, to overlap, just as a piece of news I just got recently, to overlap with both the surveillance society and fake news, and also the complicity of social media companies. For those of you still using Facebook, Facebook is monitoring those that visit or inquire about abortion services, and they sell that information to those.
Are they already selling it?
Oh yeah, they share it with those that are trying to convince people not to have abortions, to trying to re-educate them. They take that information right here, they pass it along to the other side.
But only if you go through Facebook, right?
Right. And well, you know, Facebook is also very good at monitoring offline activities too, through third parties. So yet another reason to be wary of companies like this and their insatiable desire to profit off of hate, misinformation, and misery.
So I was at an event quite some time ago, which was about digital security.
Yeah.
And a couple of experts were on the stage, and they said, and now we're going to talk about digital security. And then they started to laugh.
Oxymoron.
Yeah. So you know, Google Sidewalk tried to set up this total surveillance society in Toronto. They were going to have this community in which every breath you took was going to be monitored.
Yeah.
And they were trying to sell this as a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, like, this is going to help you. I don't know exactly how. So,
well, they were going to, I mean, I went up, we've talked about this because I went up to Toronto.
Yeah, because
and
you were quite strongly against it.
I interviewed all those that were opposed to it. It was called Sidewalk Toronto, and the deputy mayor of New York, one-time deputy mayor Dan Doctoroff, was the lead person. Everybody remember Doctoroff? And he was sent up there with a contingent to set up a smart city on the waterfront of Toronto.
Oh, he was going to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, with the help of basically every local official who had
Quite
been
a few of them.
convinced, or, and with a big kickoff ceremony with Justin Trudeau and Eric Schmidt.
I know, it was awful.
And it was, the fix was in before anyone had a chance to examine any of the foundational documents or agreements, and but it was considered this benevolent act.
You know,
that Google would come to Toronto, this poor city. And
early days of the internet. Isn't this going to be wonderful? We're all going to share our idealistic thoughts and benevolent plans. And where did that go?
Well, you know what was great, though, in Toronto is that they saw it as a blank canvas, and also, you know, they played to maybe, you know, Canadians, you know, security about, gullibility, and so
We're
you said it, I didn't.
Nice people. We don't suspect anybody of having evil aims.
Well, they
except for me, I suspect them.
Well, it was considered a done deal until a very small group of activists.
Yes, including Jim Balsillie.
Jim Balsillie, the founder of BlackBerry, interestingly enough, but Bianca Wiley, this brilliant urbanist writer, Julie DiLorenzo, who was on the board of, you know, the real estate board, a lot of insiders and outsiders who banded together, really no more than a few dozen people.
What are you doing?
And they asked questions, saw what was the public benefit to this private corporation owning all of our data, because smart cities, and they're coming here, they're coming everywhere, seek to gather minute by minute granular information about everybody's movements, what they say, what you text, and where you go, what you buy, and put it all together in a more complete, sellable picture about human behavior and you know, commercial activity. And so they were going to own every minute of every day of everybody living within this part of the city.
And was this going to include photos of you taking off your underpants?
Of course.
Of course.
But you know...
And who are they going to sell that to?
Here in New York, you're photographed at least 100 times a day.
Not
in
necessarily within the shower.
Yeah, not yet. Anyway, the point being that your fellow Canadians, a very small group of people, raised enough noise, they made it enough trouble, they asked enough questions that Google Sidewalk packed up one day under the cloak of darkness, really, with COVID as an excuse, and that building by the waterfront that was theirs is now a budget rental car. So,
well,
it's a great story. But it just shows, like, activism doesn't have to be super hyper-organized. You can come at it from many different angles and not agree on everything.
Yes.
It's the same way we've been talking
about.
Yeah,
and it's also a story about getting stuff sprung on you and then being told, well, that's already, it's already planned. There's nothing you can do like that. Fait accompli.
Yeah.
So just to fill in this picture, I'm so old, that I remember when the Iron Curtain was still there, and we were in Berlin, which was West Berlin, which is where I actually started on a German typewriter writing The Handmaid's Tale. And at that time, we went to Czechoslovakia, which was still behind the curtain. We went to East Germany, similar, and we went to Poland. And that was really interesting. So who could say what to who, when, and under what conditions? So the most locked down was East Germany. And if you've seen that film, The Lives of Others, and you've seen the unsealing of the Stasi records, you will know why. It was very surveilled. Czechoslovakia, you can talk to people, but they wouldn't talk to you in a car. They wouldn't talk to you in a hotel room. They wouldn't talk to you in a building. They just assumed that everything was bugged, which it kind of was. So we were shown the hotel room, and the bellman went, he's pointing to the chandelier. So the microphone was in the chandelier, and then he said, and then we went around the corner, and he said, "Can I buy some dollars?"
Wow.
Like that. But you could talk to people out in fields, but they had to trust you that you weren't then going to go off and write about it and say, "I talked to somebody." They had to trust you. Poland, on the other hand, was pretty wide open even then. This would be 1984. And they took us to the Writers' Union, which was supposed to be a government organization. And we were right there in this government organization, and they said, "Would you like some samizdat?" That's like forbidden literature. And we said, "Sure." And they said, "Just wait a minute." They were keeping it right there. So they were, yeah. And what was the difference? They had a strong opposition to the government in Poland. And what was that? It wasn't yet solidarity. It was the Catholic Church, which the communists had been unable to do away with. So there's pluses and minuses to that, but one of the pluses was they were strongly in favor of the dismantling of this system, and particularly at that time because the government had just killed a Catholic priest and put him in the trunk of a car. So everybody was quite up in arms about that. So you never know when these things will suddenly collapse.
Right.
And we were there in Berlin again, just as the wall was coming down, and that was a sudden, unexpected collapse. So nobody in 1984 thought that was going to happen. It was still Checkpoint Charlie, it was still sewed up pretty tight, and then all of a sudden, down it went. You could buy pieces of the wall. Colored was more expensive. I think people went out and colored them at night. You can buy little pieces, make them into earrings. So it's just very, it can change like that, and plus and minus. It took Hitler a year to sew everything up. Let us not forget that he was elected.
Yeah. Well, there was a book that we both like a lot called We.
Evgeny Zamyatin, who had been an old Bolshevik. And let us not forget that old Bolshevism was very idealistic, and it had this idea of, participation and communitarianism and making decisions together, and things were going to be equal and fair and just, and gender rights. That didn't take long to dismantle. But by 1922-23, which is when he was writing We, he could already see Stalin coming. So We has got the original Big Brother in it. Big influence on Orwell. And it's got a total surveillance society. Everybody lives in a glass house. You know that old joke, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So they all live in glass houses so that everybody can see what everybody else is doing at any time, except when they're having their pre-assigned sex hours. They have some window shades. But who you have sex with, that's assigned. You have a ticket for it. Ticket for sex. There was a city, and I refer you to Marilyn French's 3-volume epic of women's history called From Eve to Dawn. There were portions of the early Soviet Socialist Republic in which the theory was that sex is a good. Sex is a good, and therefore it should be shared communally. And therefore any woman who refused to have sex with a member of the party was against the revolution. Just think about that for a minute. It didn't last long, but there it was.
Well, you write about sort of the difference between we societies and I societies, and I wonder if you could sort of differentiate between those two and sort of what bits of each philosophy would you take to make sort of a utopia?
So every society is both. So there are very few individuals, although Ebenezer Scrooge and A Christmas Carol would be one of them, in which the I is a solitary figure thinking only of himself, with no family, no friends, no relations, no other people that he feels any connection to. That's the position of Scrooge at the beginning of that story. What happens at the end? Reformed Scrooge has a party, goes to dinner with other people, gives away turkeys. So he becomes more we from a solitary I. So they did a study of we societies and I societies and how people looked at pictures, like pictures hanging in an art gallery. And the people in we societies noticed the surround. They noticed the context first, and then they put the central figures in that context that they had noticed. The I society people looked at the central figure first, and then they looked at the context. So it's a different way of seeing people and understanding people. So do you see yourself in terms of your family network, or do you see yourself in terms of me, an individual, who might also have these connections, but really me, the individual, is at the center of the picture? So the other thing is to whom do you feel responsible?
Right.
Do you feel responsible to your society? Do you feel responsible to your family? Do you feel responsible only to yourself? And Protestantism as a religion vis-a-vis Catholicism tended to be more I-centered. So it was your relationship with God, okay? And that's why the 17th century American Puritans were such big journal keepers. They were writing down their experiences, their religious, things in their journals, and then ripping out all the pages that had to do with the Salem witchcraft trials,
right?
Which they also did.
Well, I feel like, when, and you've written about it, but there's this kind of strange combination of the we and the I that goes on in the tech world, especially as we experience it in California on a daily
The tech world. Well, this is in your book, because your books about the tech world, everybody's eerily polite. I mean, they just, they give me the creeps.
Well, I think that's
so polite.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a we society thing.
Yeah, and they're monitoring each other all the time. Like
right.
They're always checking each other's choice of words.
Right.
Yes.
I feel
now,
like
Dave, that wasn't a very nice thing to say. I think you might want to rephrase that, Dave.
Right. And there's you
might want to
also
rethink that. Possibly you misspoke.
This is I'm sure a lot of you are living through it right now, but it is this weird combination, like in New York, of the I, because there is so much self-celebration with the current social media landscape, but at the same time, this terror of offending. And so you end up with this weird kind of unholy alliance between the two, where people live in great fear of, they want to self-celebrate, and but at the same time, there are great consequences for not being...
I feel really humble, Dave. I feel so humble. No, I don't. Yeah, gosh. Woo. Yeah, I'm sure you feel quite humble, because you live on the West Coast, and you have to feel humble when you live out there.
Yeah.
So you're going to be in deep doo-doo.
That's true enough. Let's talk. Let's go back to.
I think he's blushing. I think David's. No, you're not.
I got some other notes here.
Seems to me that you totally nailed it, but it was awfully mean that girl got shoved off a mountain.
Yeah, she just revealed the ending to my book, so everybody just saved $28 right there.
No, they didn't, because they have to read the lead-in.
Yeah, there's other parts to it.
I always look at the ends of the books.
You could skim it, and then you know the ending. It's fine. So how the Testament ends, I don't know if you knew, there were some documents. I'm not going to do that to you, but there were documents. So
So which documents are we, and the word documents is now pretty loaded, Dave.
Let's just say that documents figure into the end of the Gilead, right?
Oh, documents, yes, those documents, yes, for sure. So I'm going to tell you a secret about that. Oh, I shouldn't do this.
Well, speaking of, no, we won't. But speaking of documents, I want to jump ahead just a little bit because we're running out of time. But, you know, you've been a champion of the written word, of the printed book, and there's a project that is going on in Norway called the Future Library. And I wondered if you could just tell us what this is and how you got involved with it.
Okay, so the Future Library of Norway, it began as an art project by Katie Patterson, who specializes in slow time. And she hooked up with the Oslo Library. She's Scottish. And they were building a new library, and she talked them into having a room called the Future Library of Norway in the new library. And the idea was to ask a writer one a year from around the world to contribute a manuscript to the Future Library of Norway. And nobody would know what was in it. The rules were quite simple. It had to be made of words, no just bunging your photo album in. So it had to be made of words, and apart from that, it could be anything. So it could be a single word, it could be a letter, it could be a novel, it could be a short story, it could be a play, a laundry list, an essay, anything you chose made out of words. And they came to me first. They obviously were looking for writers who would actually do this, because some of them would say, are you out of your mind? You want me to write something and not publish it and wait for 100 years and nobody's going to read it till then? So for 100 years, this scheme would go on, and they would collect all the secret manuscripts. And meanwhile, a forest of trees that they had planted near Oslo would be growing. And on the 100th year, they would open all the boxes, they would cut down enough trees to make the paper to print an anthology of the Future Library of Norway. And that was the art project. So I said, sure. So they knew I probably would, because it's an intriguing project. It's a very hopeful project, and it got a lot of interest because it was so hopeful. And over I went with my little box. I tied it up with a blue ribbon, and I thought they were going to say to me at customs, what's in the box? And I would have to say, I'm not allowed to tell you. And then I would be arrested. But that didn't happen. It sailed through, and we went into the forest. There were the trees. They'd put little ribbons on them so we wouldn't step on them. And everybody made speeches. I handed over the box, and that's been going on now since 2014. Different writer every year.
I wondered if you'd read the end of a couple paragraphs, the end of your essay about that library and your contribution.
If I can see it, Dave. Let's try. There we are. As a child, I was one of those who buried treasures in jars with the idea that someone someday might come along and dig them up. I found similar things while digging in the various gardens I have made: rusty nails, old medicine bottles, fragments of china plates. Once in the Canadian Arctic, I found a tiny doll carved of wood. Rare wood, for no trees grow there, and such a piece of wood must have been driftwood. That is what the Future Library is like, in part. It will contain fragments of lives that were once lived and that are now the past. But all writing is a method of preserving and transmitting the human voice. The marks of the writing, made by ink, printer ink, brush, stylus, chisel, lie inert, like the marks on a musical score, until a reader arrives to bring the voice back to life. How strange it is to think of my own voice, silent by then for a long time, suddenly being awakened after 100 years. What is the first thing that voice will say as a not yet embodied hand draws it out of its container and opens it to the first page? I picture this encounter between my text and the so far non-existent reader as being a little like the red painted handprint I once saw on the wall of a Mexican cave that had been sealed for over 3 centuries. Who now can decipher the exact meaning? But its general meaning was universal. Any human being could read it. It said, "Greetings, I was here."
Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Atwood, thank you so much. Thank you for all you've done, Margaret. Thank you for supporting PEN.
Please welcome the author of 18 books and PEN America trustee, Jennifer Finney Boylan.
Wow. Hello, everyone. How are you? Thanks for being here. Well, like many of you, since August 12th, I've been thinking about the Satanic Verses and its author. In describing his novel, Sir Salman once said, "The book isn't actually about Islam, but about migration, metamorphosis, divided selves, love, death, London and Bombay." There are a lot of things I admire about that book: its inventiveness, its humor, and sure, its difficulty. But as a transgender woman and writer, I can tell you that it's the theme of divided selves and metamorphosis that hits closest to home for me. That novel is, at least in part, a meditation upon the ways in which we morph over time, leave the things we have been behind, and turn, unexpectedly, into something new: angels and devils, heroes and villains, men and women. All of our lives, one way or another, are the stories of people who start out as one thing, crying babies, say, and transform over the course of a long life into something else. Older people shaped and scarred by forces of disaster and fortune, catastrophe and love. Which is why, of the many tools that writers have, I've always felt that the most important one is revision, the practice of taking something you've created, something promising but imperfect, and making it better. When I was on the threshold of transition, in fact, it was this that helped me most clearly understand what I needed to do next. That in order for the story of my life to be true, I somehow had to do the hardest thing I could imagine and set about the process of creating my own next draft. As we celebrate our centenary, it's right to remember the way that PEN, too, has morphed and changed and reinvented itself over the last 100 years. Which is fortunate because over the course of its history, there have been many writers whom PEN did not think of as worth defending. There was a time when black writers were not part of PEN. There was a time when women writers were not part of PEN. There was a time when gay and lesbian writers were not part of PEN. There was a time, believe it or not, when transgender writers were not part of PEN. It was not so long ago when PEN found itself too squeamish to even defend writers with AIDS. If you don't mind, I'd like to share an excerpt from a letter written by Larry Kramer to our then President Susan Sontag in 1987. And I would read this in my Larry Kramer voice, except I don't have one. Fortunately for you. Dear Susan, I don't want to belong to PEN because I think it has an intolerable attitude toward anything gay. There are panels and discussions and meetings and committees and prizes on and for just about every avenue of literature except gay and lesbian writing. That almost 8 years into the worst epidemic in history, PEN has still not said boo about AIDS in any fashion or form is, to this mind anyway, even more insupportable and inhumane. Your newsletter is filled issue after issue with causes you support and fight for. None of these has ever been gay. How dare PEN never have addressed the issue of AIDS in any form of discussion, benefit, protest? I'm ashamed of the whole lot of your membership, which contains not a few gay and lesbian writers, many openly so. I am a gay writer. I am inestimably proud of being a gay writer. Today, more than ever, I'm sick of seeing our contributions to everything being swept under the carpet and back into the closet. Because AIDS is in the process of quite successfully decimating the gay male population of the world, it is more imperative than ever that the world knows who we are and what gay men have given to it. Until PEN is ready to acknowledge that gay and lesbian writers and writing exist on a par with black women, prisoners, Iron Curtain, all the, you name it, and PEN supports it, other categories of writing and writers, I want nothing to do with you. So please, save your money. Remove me from your mailing list. Sincerely yours, Larry Kramer. Thanks, Larry. Yeah. I hope it's fair to say that these many years later, PEN does a better job of defending the words of LGBTQ writers. Which is good, because we continue to be among the most at-risk authors in the world. Our books are still being banned in this country by fascists and demagogues and creeps. Our words remain at risk. Our books remain at risk. Our lives remain at risk. A few years ago, I was walking north on Hudson Street in the West Village, en route to the old White Horse Tavern, where I'd planned to meet up with a writer friend of mine for a few beers. Then I passed a young woman who stopped a few paces later and called out to me. "Jenny Boylan," she said. I turned back and said, "Yes." She told me her name, said that she'd grown up in Texas, and then she said, "I just wanted to thank you. I used to think there was no one else in the world who felt the thing I feel. But later, when I read your book, I understood that maybe I could survive and eventually become myself." Then she asked if she could hug me. So there I was, hugging a complete stranger, one of my readers on Hudson Street. I should probably say that this being New York, after she headed on her way, I did check to make sure I still had my wallet. Anyway, I know it seems immodest to talk about our words changing people's lives, but I think that everyone I'm sharing the stage with here today, Margaret, David, Ayad, Chimamanda, has had some variation on this experience. You can only react to moments like this with humility, but it's important to remember the stories that we tell, all of us, really can actually save people's lives. Which is why it's shocking to think of how many of our books are now being banned. So far as I can tell, every writer speaking today has had a book that has been banned, with a possible exception of Ayad Akhtar, which, you know, kind of makes me want to say, "Come on, Ayad, get back to work." But the most common titles appearing on any banned books list are always books about LGBTQ experience. And it's no secret why conservatives and others are trying to stop people from reading these books. Their idea is that if they can erase our stories, it will be as if we don't exist. But banning Two Boys Kissing by David Levithan doesn't mean there won't be any more gay men. Banning The Handmaid's Tale doesn't mean there won't be any more feminists. Banning Captain Underpants and the sensational saga of Sir Stinks-a-Lot doesn't mean that there won't be any more, well, what shall we call them? Disruptive individuals. And banning books by me doesn't mean that there won't be any more transgender people. It just means that more and more of us will feel alone and will be convinced, just like that woman told me on the street, that there's no one else in the world who feels the thing I feel. So, there was a time, in fact, when I was the one who felt alone in the world because I couldn't find any stories about transgender people who'd lived full and happy lives. That was the summer I drove my Volkswagen to Nova Scotia by myself in hopes of jumping off of a cliff up there and plunging into the ocean. because I couldn't imagine surviving my life. In the absence of stories, it seemed like my life was destined to bring me only violence and shame. So there I stood at the edge of a cliff in Nova Scotia, looking down at the terrible sea. And yet something held me back. Instead, after that long journey, I began another one, the long journey home. I'm grateful that I survived that moment, but it shouldn't have taken a failed suicide to bring me hope. What I needed at that moment were stories of a life like mine, stories like the ones later told by Janet Mock, stories like the ones told by Jan Morris, stories like the ones told by Canary Khan and Meredith Taliesin and Alex Marizano-Lesnevich and Jameson Green. Each of these writers' words would have given me hope, made me realize that I was not alone. In 2013, when Penn finally got around to honoring Larry Kramer, he said, "Theater is too small. We have to think bigger as writers. We have to try and change the world." Well, I agree that we have to try and change the world, but with respect to Larry Kramer, I think he's wrong when he says that theater is too small. There's nothing bigger than a play. There is nothing bigger than a novel. There's nothing bigger than a poem. Because these are the things that give people hope, that enable us to turn away from the edges of terrible cliffs and begin our own journeys toward home. A poet's work, Salman Rushdie says in the Satanic Verses, is to name the unnameable, to point at frauds, to take sides, start arguments, to shape the world and stop it from going to sleep. With the help of writers and editors and poets and readers around the world, we have and will continue to do just that. First with one draft, and then with another, we will shape the world and stop it from going to sleep. With Penn's help and with all of yours, we will tell the stories that let young people, and old ones too, know that they matter, that they can live and write and read with courage and love and grace. Thanks.
We will now have a brief intermission. All speakers will be back to close the event. The program will resume in 10 minutes with remarks by Akhtar, followed by a final conversation featuring all of our speakers. Use your index cards to submit a question for Q&A.
Democracy is more than mere majoritarianism. In a truly free democratic society, all citizens must feel free all the time, whether they end up on the winning or losing side. If freedom of expression is under attack, if religious freedom is threatened, and if substantial parts of society live in physical fear for their safety, then such a society cannot be said to be a true democracy. It has been my fate to be the target of a campaign of hostility and falsification, which has created a kind of false self. And I am profoundly grateful to the world of books, the world of words, for permitting me to maintain a different narrative. I believe in free speech, but we shouldn't upset anybody. I believe in free speech, but let's not go too far. The point about it is the moment you limit free speech, it's not free speech. The point about it is that it's free. A poem will not stop a bullet. A novel cannot defuse a bomb. Not all our satirists are heroes. Here at Penn, our task is to try to defend and protect the artist as well as the art, the writer in prison as well as his imprisoned or forbidden words. Originality is dangerous. If you want to increase the sum of what is possible for human beings, this is the kind of art whose right to exist we must not only defend, but celebrate. Art is not entertainment. At its very best, it's a revolution.
Welcome, playwright, novelist, Pulitzer Prize winner, and president of PEN America, Akhtar.
Thank you. I was just out of high school when the Satanic Verses was published, swiftly condemned and forbidden to those of my ilk. See, I grew up in a Muslim family, in a Muslim community in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'd grown up going to the mosque on the south side of town, which was often the highlight of my week. There, I would hear stories that made sense of the world for me, stories in which our prophet, Muhammad, was often the hero. These stories explained why life was so hard, why there was so much suffering, and why there was always hope for the future. It was at that mosque that I also understood how aggrieved we Muslims should feel at being exploited and humiliated by a predatory West, which used us against each other in its great game contest for resources and positioning on the map. And it was there at that mosque that I also heard about a rare breed of Muslim who turned his back on the faith. Such a one was unimaginable to us. Our holy writ, we were told, condemned such as these to death. My final year of high school brought on the onset of skepticism and had me paying closer attention to what I heard at the mosque on weekends. My recent encounters with Ivan Karamazov and Albert Camus had caused me to wonder about the cosmic order I'd been taught and which I'd never questioned. But even so, I was not prepared for the fallout when the Rushdie affair landed like a mortar shell in our community. And though there was disagreement, some saw the fatwa as political posturing on the part of Iran. Others felt the attention was unseemly, press making us look even worse to those in whose midst we found ourselves than they already thought us to be. Though there was disagreement, everyone was in accord about one thing. Rushdie had crossed a line, and the punishment sought was ultimately deserved. He had turned his back on us. He had maligned what should have been most sacred to him. He had sided with the West and its obsession, as we saw it, to humiliate us. That rare breed of Muslim who not only walked away from us, but then mocked us behind our backs. Death wasn't really even harsh enough as we saw it. One of the effects of this unanimous and profound disgust in my community was that you couldn't be seen with the book. Copies of it were burned. It was forbidden. which of course only made me more interested in it. Later that spring, while away at college, I would finally overcome the feeling I was doing something wrong, and I would become one of the few in my community and the only person in my very large extended family who would actually read it. I was shocked by what I read. The novel's savage, playful beauty disarmed me. I found myself discovering in what offended those I loved something extraordinarily new. The book's postmodern satire of the mythos I'd grown up with struck me not as blasphemy, but as the extension of my own deepest urge to know more deeply. That same urge that had animated my religious longing and was the reason I so looked forward to weekends at the mosque. The Satanic Verses may have been the first time I experienced authentic awe with a work of art. In its pages, I heard a call to something higher than creed. I heard a call to language in service of truth, even at the expense of belonging to my community. It was my first encounter with the sheer force of literature and with the trouble it could get me into. Though Penn played a significant role in defending Salman through the fatwa, it wasn't until a few years later that I first heard of the organization. In Nigeria, a writer named Ken Saro-Wiwa was being persecuted for standing up to Royal Dutch Shell Oil for environmental degradation in the Niger Delta. His advocacy was nonviolent, but that didn't stop him from being imprisoned and sentenced to death by a government it was widely believed was doing the oil company's bidding. The campaign on the part of Penn International to bring attention to what was happening was considerable and was the reason I knew about any of it. But Penn couldn't prevent his execution. On November 10th, 1995, Saro-Wiwa was hanged along with 8 other activists, together known as the Ogoni Nine. That it was even possible a multinational corporate conglomerate could have a writer killed shocked me. A different kind of shock than that of reading the Satanic Verses, but a shock of commensurate force, and one in which I heard the call to language once again in service of truth. Saro-Wiwa had spoken truth to the order of visible power, which was different than Salman's challenge to religious belief, an order of hidden power. And yet in both cases, the consequence of speaking was the same, the threat of death. In Saro-Wiwa's case, it was a threat realized. In Salman's, thankfully, not yet, and hopefully never, notwithstanding last month's brutal attack. Shell Oil would end up settling with the Saro-Wiwa family, paying without admitting guilt, which is why we can't pair Shell with Saro-Wiwa's state murder without the mitigating qualifier, such as alleged or suspected. The settlement protects the company against reputational harm. It was reputational harm, too, that occasioned the furious and unanimous condemnation of the Satanic Verses by my fellow Muslims in Milwaukee, harm to the reputation of our prophet and to our reputations as Muslims in the modern world. Harm, then, is apparently the consequence of note. Harm to the one speaking, harm to the one spoken about. This past December, American novelist Carmen Maria Machado addressed our annual members meeting with a speech voicing her worry about a different kind of harm, one she saw increasingly staking its claim on our imaginative production. The harm she was worried about is what some are calling artistic theft, that is, the repurposing of other people's lives into the, quote, patchwork of invention and borrowing that she identified is what fiction has always been, end quote. I urge you all to find her speech, which is online. It's a profound defense of fiction, a defense in part of stealing from the lives of others to make fiction, a theft in service of literature as a tool to know reality. Machado ended her speech with a passionate articulation of her deepest concern, that those coming of age now, learning the art of fiction today, would be stymied, stunted by the widespread worry about the so-called ethics of writing fiction, and that ultimately both writers and readers would end up profoundly impoverished because of it. Only weeks earlier, English novelist and Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro voiced his concern about young writers today having to contend with harm of a different sort, the bullying and exclusion suffered by many who write from points of view that are not their own. Appropriation, he called it. Ishiguro noted that he had always appropriated, that is, written from points of view very different from himself. It's what we all admire so much about his extraordinary body of work. Do we really believe that the harm of appropriation is greater than the benefit of artistic empathy? Isn't the artist's magical self-insertion into the lives of others the very act of moral and aesthetic enlargement that defines what is most singular and necessary about literature? And which is only possible through freedom? This singular freedom of the artist to imagine widely, to imagine completely, without fetters? Defending and supporting and protecting this freedom to imagine is one way of seeing the essence of our cause at Penn, and it is a worthy one. Admittedly, it's easy for us to repudiate the assault on freedom represented by the fatwa on Salman or the killing of Sarawiwa. It can be harder to discern the assault on our freedom when the threat is sanctioned by pieties with which we sympathize. But that doesn't make these nearer threats any less real. Indeed, any defense of the freedom to speak must contend with the fact that we will say things that harm those much closer to us than the Ayatollah. As Salman himself once said, what is freedom of expression? Without the freedom to offend, it ceases to exist. At PEN America, we pride ourselves in protecting freedom of expression. We see the free exchange of speech as central not only to artistic pursuit, but to self-governance and to advance itself. Advances in scientific and human knowledge, in moving ever closer to our political ideals, all of this is contingent on the exchange of ideas that must prove themselves worthy of our consideration, worthy of our acceptance. Protecting the freedom that enables this exchange is ultimately about protecting our capacity to know reality by our own lights. And thus, it is a paramount value, and one that matters more, far more, than protecting us from the harms that the exercise of this freedom may cause. Especially at a time when we find ourselves in the midst of the most significant repression of free speech by American legislatures in my lifetime, again, under the guise of the so-called harm such speech allegedly causes their constituencies. Here's the disconcerting truth. There isn't actually anything like a fail-safe protection of our freedom to imagine, to inquire, to know, to exchange, to speak. Yes, we at Penn can rally others to believe that such freedom is in our collective interest. We can encourage attitudes that support that belief. We can support those who have run afoul of others who would stanch that freedom. But at root, one is only as free as one's willingness to suffer the consequence of exercising that freedom, which is why any defense of free speech is only as strong as those willing to heed it. Which is why writers like Rushdie and Sarawiwa and Solzhenitsyn and Taslima Nasreen and Liu Xiaobo and Ruben Salazar and so many others like them, past, present, and future, it's why writers like this are so inspiring to us. Their courage gives us strength. Strength to believe, as that first Penn cohort did when they gathered 100 years ago, that writers could make more than just a meaningful difference. For at their best, writers are stewards of our highest ideals, which is why coming together to support the most courageous amongst us can itself be a transformative act. It reminds us that the world is made not only in opposition to what we most want, but also because of it. In the centuries since that first gathering of writers who called themselves Penn, the succession of Penn members and Penn chapters and the writers they've defended, it's all part of a legacy that attests to the force of literature, to the rare and radical freedom of the artist, and to writing as a matter of ultimate importance, or as Salman would put it, a matter of having the last word. The final passage of Salman's upcoming novel, Victory City, had me thinking a great deal about the artist's place in the world, and I quote from it here. How are they remembered, these kings, these queens? While they lived, they were victors or vanquished. No longer. Words are the only victors. What they did or thought or felt no longer exists. Only words describing those things remain. Their deeds only exist in the way they have been set down. All that remains is this city of words. Words are the only victors. Thank you.
Please welcome back to the stage Suzanne Nossel, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Dave Eggers, Margaret Atwood, Jennifer Finney Boylan, and Akhtar for a dialogue with the audience.
Great. Welcome everyone. We're delighted to have all of our speakers back here on stage. I have some questions that have come through the audience. If you have written on a card or you want to write on a card, there are PEN America staff who are around the room and who could take that from you. And just to kick it off, I'm going to start this way and just ask each of you kind of quickly to talk about a time where your freedom of expression was threatened, or how close have you gotten to having your freedom of expression actually directly threatened personally? Jenny?
Want me to go? I was walking in front of the New York Times building and somebody came up to me and said, "Did you write that column?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he says, you better retract that column. You better retract that column. It's a bunch of bullshit. And he got angrier and angrier and angrier, and he started swearing at me, and he poked me
Really?
like in the chest. And I did the brave thing, and I turned and I ran. And then what's funny, later I said to the editor of the opinion page, who at that time was James Bennett, I told him what had happened. And he said, "Oh, yeah, that guy." Guess I wasn't there first, which made me feel a little bit worse. But anyway, that's my story.
Okay, Margaret.
Well, we didn't get death threats for the novel of The Handmaid's Tale, but when the first film came out in 1989, we did get some death threats. And I said, why did we get death threats for the film but not for the book? And they said, "Oh, those people don't read." But it was confusing to me because I was just, setting forth in a book an agenda that they had already announced. So why were they death threatening me for saying that they would do what they said they wanted to do?
Dave.
As a publisher, my first experience was back, we had a magazine in the 90s called Might, and we had an issue about the AIDS crisis. We were in San Francisco and just had people telling their stories about navigating the sex and their sex lives during that time. And our printer, who had been printing this magazine in the middle of Minnesota for years, called up one day and said that they wouldn't print it. That the people on press, the pressmen, wouldn't print it, that they refused to print it, which was a wake-up call that they had that you could get past all kinds of barriers and that the actual people on press would walk out and not print the magazine. We sued, we won, they had to print it, and they had to pay us for the delays, so that was good. It's good to have lawyers or advocates on your side, but that was my first
Were you doing libel chill?
What's that?
Did you do libel chill on them?
I don't know what that is. Libel chill?
I don't know what it is. Yes, you sued them.
Yeah, it was a strongly worded letter.
I'm teasing you, I'm sorry.
You sued your own employees, though?
What's that?
They were your own employees? Or?
No, this was a printer.
Oh, it was outside printer.
In Minnesota, we were in San Francisco.
So that's like an early version of the suing of the bakery that wouldn't make the cake for the gay couple.
Me on the bakery.
So you were ahead of the curve. Yeah, there you go. That seems relevant.
Dave was the pioneer.
Issues that last to this day.
Yeah, pioneer of suing people.
Chimamanda.
Margaret's story actually inspired me and made me remember a similar story that I have. When Half of a Yellow Sun, my novel about the Nigerian Biafran War, was published in Nigeria, nothing happened. And then when the film came out, it was censored. It was actually banned from being shown in any theater in Nigeria. And the reason was that they said that it would incite ethnic violence. And so I thought the novel has been out for years. I mean, if it was going to incite ethnic violence, it would have, but yeah. And then later, they allowed the film to show, but they took out some bits of it.
Ayad?
Many times, the most recent episode is around a current project that I'm involved in. I'm writing a very sort of ambitious show about Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg for HBO. And before we had landed at HBO, we'd been at another streamer, and they got cold feet. The CEO, very famous billionaire, who sells lots of books, got cold feet after I wrote a second episode. And then we were back out in the marketplace, and the week we were going back out to market, Deadline Hollywood publishes, 9 a.m. LA time, a letter, cease and desist letter from Facebook, threatening anyone involved with this project, any future potential network, any insurer, any producer, any talent associated with, if they move forward with this, quote, reckless project, punishing lawsuits. So, we had an issue on Penn just because I couldn't write the letter that I would write for anybody else if it had happened. I had to recuse myself, so some members of the staff wrote a wonderful letter. So yeah, I mean, it's, the sort of corporate totalitarian stranglehold on certain stories is alive and well.
Well, that brings me to one of the first question I'll ask from our audience. And I think this is a great question. It's something that comes up at PEN America a lot, which is, how do you balance creating space for people to tell their own stories against the notion of artistic expression that says anyone can write about anything? And that has become a basis for the kind of corporate censorship that you're talking about, because corporations have become very sensitive to who's telling what stories, who's behind them, is it credible, are they going to come under fire because the author doesn't look like the characters that they've written about, and who is given the space and the opportunity to write a book, get a big advance, get a marketing budget. So how do you see this, I think very real tension?
It doesn't seem to apply to theater at all. So we have many different theater productions now, and theaters always have a lot of different people in them. And the different people in the theater, the plays, aren't always the same as the playwright.
I mean, that's changing. Unfortunately, the reality is that is becoming a deeply contentious
and the actors are not always the same as the original characters. For instance, we have a Hamlet going on right now at the Stratford Festival, in which Hamlet is a black woman. So in that area, anything seems to be possible. But in the authorship area, it seems to be the authorship area that is contested, but not the performance area. So
I'm sorry. I'm really of two minds on this, because as writers, as artists, I mean, as part of PEN, we believe that writers should be able to create the works they want to create, period. That's our mission. That's what we do. And this is what it means to have an imagination, is to imagine what it's like to be someone who is not you. And actually, even to tell the story of yourself takes imagination. So on the one hand, I feel that very strongly. At the same time, as a transgender woman, I can tell you that many, many, many of the stories written about transgender people by people who are not trans don't do a very good job of capturing the experience. And it's, we give Oscars to, to Jared Leto and to all the, every year there's another award show that's awarding someone who is not us, pretending to be us, and it fails to get the story particularly right. Now, these stories deserve to be told, they should be told, but my argument is not about censorship. My argument is that we can tell our own stories better. We can tell the stories that haven't been told because no one's asked us to tell our stories that much. So those are two different minds, but I believe them both. I know I'm going on and on, but quickly, there was a PEN event recently where I told the story of the Lion of Grimpen Castle. Do you know the story? So I believe it's in Sweden, and the King of Sweden was given a lion as a present, and when the lion died, he was sent off to the taxidermists, and they were going to have to stuff the lion, and it came back as this kind of ridiculous cartoon creature. And it's still there. You can go see it in Grimpen Castle. The reason that it looked so ridiculous and cartoonish, the taxidermists had never seen a lion before. So that's how I feel about transgender people in a lot of films made by people who have never actually talked to one.
When I have drawings of myself, because I do, drawings of myself done by people in China who've actually never seen me. I have a huge, enormous nose. Well, I do have quite a big nose anyway, but it's even bigger than usual. And I have quite a rosebud mouth. And I have an enormous amount of hair, which I don't object to. And I have quite Chinese-looking eyes, which I sort of do. But I think when you're looking at somebody who isn't you and who is somehow at a remove from you, that people have a tendency to see the features that stand out that are least like them, which is why I have such a big nose in China. I also have quite big earlobes, and a Chinese person said to me, well, that's a good thing because it means long life.
Chimamanda?
Don't you think that's a positive spin?
That's great.
So I think there's that tendency that things come out exaggerated. If it's somebody looking at them from outside, as it were. Would you say that's human?
I think, in some ways, like Jenny, I feel very strongly about two things that might seem on the surface to be contradictory, but I would argue that they're not. So I think that writers should be allowed to write whatever they want. I believe very fiercely in art and in creativity. On the other hand, I think that we live in a world that is real, and that there are political realities and historical realities. And one of those is that often when you are a member of a group that is not necessarily even a minority, but a group whose stories have not been told, then there is a kind of, it just seems to me, almost a moral imperative that members of that group should be the ones telling the stories. I don't think they have to absolutely be. This young gentleman here, for example, wrote a book called What is the What? And which was really well done, but it was a story about a Sudanese boy. And he apparently isn't a Sudanese boy. But so in general, I do think that representation matters. I think that it is in fact possible to balance both when we're thinking about who gets to be published, who gets to be pushed in many ways. As a person from a continent that has for so long been misunderstood, written about by people who are not of the continent, I feel quite strongly about stories that come out from Africa, about how they're told. And in general, I think Africans do it best. But I think it's also possible for some other people who are not African to do it, but you have to do the work. I mean, I think really then becomes a question of, it requires extra work. If a white person is going to write a black person's story, they better do the bloody work, because I think it will require more work.
I guess here, just to put a wrinkle on it, when it comes, the argument that, look, it has to be done well, who decides? I mean, you have cases like American Dirt, which was a very high-profile, sparked a very high-profile debate over this, and people were divided about whether it had been done well or not. I mean, some Mexican-American or Mexican writers endorsed the book wholeheartedly, and others excoriated it. And so, can we really sort of use that as the dividing line between, when you can traverse these boundaries?
Yeah, but debate is good. I think that the debate that came out of that was good, and I'll go back to when I wrote What is the What, I had no intentions of doing such a thing. I received a letter in the mail one day from Mary Williams, who was the head of the Lost Boys Foundation and also the daughter of Black Panthers from East Oakland, and she wrote to me saying, will you fly to Atlanta and will you write Valentino Deng's story? We've been working with him for years. He wants a story told. And then Valentino asked me, and Manute Bol, one of the leaders of the South Sudanese liberation movement, told me that I had to bring Valentino's story to a Western audience. And again, I had other things I felt like I was going to be writing about, but as a journalist, our task was to tell untold stories and bring them to a larger audience. And so Valentino and I spent the next 4 years working on his story. And Chimamanda was nice enough to sort of stick up for the book and when it came out. And but for sure, those stories should be told by somebody that knows that experience intimately. And I think every so often there can be some, I guess, something that, I don't know, I guess that sometimes there's another way sometimes. And in our case, it was a collaboration over many years. I was never paid for the book, and so much good came out of it with Valentino being able to start a system of schools in South Sudan, and so much awareness came out of it, and it received the endorsement of the South Sudanese community in South Sudan and here. But it is I think, the exception to the rule. I think that if our experience.
Yeah.
If I'd had, early in my career, now at all the publishing houses, they have these things called sensitivity readers. People call sensitivity readers.
Explain what that is in case not everybody knows.
Someone who is familiar with a particular community because they are a member of that community will read a work that treats a representation of that community and sort of file a report or sort of weigh in on their opinions about authenticity and what have you. And and I've spoken to, we have publishers on our board. I've spoken about this issue with some of the high-powered publishers we have on our board. And, I've been very clear. If there had been sensitivity readers early in my career, I wouldn't have a career. I wouldn't have a career because I'm persona non grata. I mean, my folks were so outcast, turned into pariahs in the local community where I grew up, and I generally, and anecdotally, this is, off the record if anybody's writing about this. I can't tell you how many times, it's pen. It's an honor
We won't
honor
censor
code.
you, don't
honor
worry.
code. I can't tell you how many times in New York City people have said, don't get too close to Salman because you're going to lose credibility. This is very, very sophisticated sort of folks, because there is this thing of folks not wanting to see themselves in a certain light because it may portray them in a way that they don't want the dominant majority to see, or what have you. So, I think it's tricky, and I think that we are, I joke, I feel like we are potentially entering into an era of socialist realism without the genocide, and I worry that who is going to litigate these issues? Who is the arbiter? Who is the judge? There isn't one. I think an artist has to be free to write whatever. And then the sort of corporate push and the advances and all of that stuff, that's not really a philosophical issue. That's a systemic issue. That's something that we want to take a look at or that we want to understand differently. But the philosophy is that a writer's free to write whatever. I mean, and yes, they should do it well. I mean, I hope they would want to try to do it well.
So this goes back a long way. You know that Charles Dickens encountered it in the 19th century. He wrote Oliver Twist, and it has a bad Jewish person in it, namely Fagin. So the Jewish community actually went to him and said, don't you know how harmful this is? And so he wrote a good, saintly Jewish character whom nobody remembers. That person was called Reuben. Anybody Victorianists? No? So I'm the only person who knows about this in the whole wide world. And then he had a character called Miss Moucher, who was a malevolent, very short person. And then he got some because he was publishing in serial form, and he got some feedback on that, which said, how can you be so unpleasant to very short people? And he changed the character sort of in mid-narrative to make the character nicer. So this is not a new thing. And I think if you're a member of a group that is getting a lot of outside pressure and persecution, of course you're going to be sensitive. Why would you not be? Sure you are. And I think the other problem is that not everybody from such a group wants to be a writer. In fact, mostly people want their kids to be doctors and lawyers, make some money, and do well, be respectable. So the people who are writers from those groups are often viewed by that group as being somewhat odd. Speaking as a person who was a female person who was wanted to write at a time when people in Canada just weren't writers anyway. I think it was actually better to be a woman because, you know, they're feeble sort of anyway, and who can expect them to be doctors and lawyers? So you can go off and do some embroidery and writing while you're at it. So we didn't have to jump over as high a bar as male Canadian people who were viewed as very odd indeed. So I think those are other factors, like why aren't you being something respectable? Yes? Ever felt that? Why aren't you being something respectable?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked that question many times. I've never had a good answer for it. Though my dad, you know, I mean, winning a Pulitzer, whatever, it's a total shock. I didn't do anything. Somebody calls me, so I can't take any credit for it. But the one really, and it's been complicated in many ways. I've often said that, you know, it made me feel like I was in a dilemma because if I believe in it, I believe that I deserve it, then I'm going to start writing badly. But one good thing that did come out of it was my dad called me and he said, my God, this Pulitzer, what? I didn't know what this was. But everybody is coming to me. The doctors, the techs, the nurses. Do you know what your son has done? He has won Pulitzer. I cannot tell you now, when they think Milwaukee, they will not think M. Akhtar. They will think A. Akhtar. And so one would like to think that, you know, kids growing up or whatever could look at, you know, some Pakistani kids who grow up. I mean, not my aunts, because they've forbidden all of my cousins to look at to read my work, but you know, that they would look up, they say, okay, well, somebody did it, they were respectable, they seem to be able to make a living, maybe I could do it too.
Yeah, so I got from my mother, when I said I was going to be a writer, she said, well, if you're going to be a writer, you better learn to spell. And I said, others will do that for me. You know, they have.
I believe that story.
All right, I have another question from our audience, and I'll embroider it a little bit or add to it. The questioner says, how can you all, as powerful writers, empower more people to vote to keep our democracy? And I guess the way I want to expand that, empower more people to vote to keep our democracy, is, you know, Margaret, I mean, you did tell us so. and yet I'm not sure we listened. I mean, you told us so as powerfully as you possibly could. You know, you achieved a level of recognition and influence for your novel and then the series and the movie, you know, that was unparalleled, and yet, you know, here we are. And I wonder how you each sort of think about that. I mean, with LGBTQ books, things did change at Penn, and, you know, there was recognition and embrace, and all of these books are being published now, you know, that never would have been, and yet we face this ferocious backlash.
You mean it wasn't all done in one night? Yeah, before I published my book, you can't believe how bad it used to be. You know, people don't remember.
Well, you know, publishers are businesses. So one of the first things they think is there an audience for this book? So I think one of the things that has happened with LGBTQ plus books is that an audience has been shown to exist. So that is one of the things that has happened.
With She's Not There, I don't think the publisher thought anything was going to happen with it.
Well, was the publisher surprised?
The publisher was surprised.
There you go. So sometimes...
I mean, Oprah helped.
Yeah, no, a little. It helps a little.
Yeah.
What do you say, I mean, what do you feel, Margaret, in terms of the ability to get a warning through to society and acted upon?
Voter registration is quite far up right now. And women are registering to vote at levels that are quite far above men registering to vote. This is new, people registering to vote. So the Roe versus Wade being overturned has had that effect. But usually people don't act on a thing unless it immediately impacts them, like them. Not somebody else in some other country, and not even somebody else in some other state, or somebody who isn't like them. If it impacts them, then they're more likely to act.
I think we have to do a lot on the educational level and get kids sort of hooked on having impact, not even before they can vote, but that they're making actual change, that they are having an impact in the local debate, even if it's just at their school or they're running a clothing drive or whatever. They get, I've seen kids, we have the centers, the closest one is called 826 New York, it's in Brooklyn. They become young activist writers. They get hooked on the impact they can have with the written word in publications. We have them write op-eds. We have them publish their own magazines, newspapers, blogs. And when you get those kids that are sort of really sort of grown up and have it in the bones, that they can have a say and that their words have power, then I think you have a generation that's, you know, never apathetic. But I remember culture, I mean, we're just people that write books and we can say, go vote, and some people might listen to us. I think even far more dangerous, I remember in 2000, I saw a pop star that I liked a lot giving a lecture, not a lecture, but an onstage conversation, and he told everybody, 1,800 people, don't vote, doesn't make a difference, there's no difference between Gore and Bush. And he said, blah, blah, blah. And he had been fed this because there was a lot of that, that the two of them were very sides of the same coin. And then we had environmental catastrophe. We had two wars, forever wars. We had so much of what we're dealing with right now happened right then with that sort of apathy and then, you know, splitting off the votes in Florida, wherever. So I think that we do have a role to play to never be quiet and to never stop talking about your vote. Always matters, always, even if it's at a little school board race that nobody's paying attention to. It ripples throughout history. It really matters, and there's never a time to take a nap.
Right.
You're here.
I have a
and it's not
question from the audience, Neil Gaiman. Where is Neil?
I'm here.
Great.
Neil, where are you?
I'm just here.
But I believe that you're there. No, I think
Hi, Margaret.
Hi, Neil.
Everybody.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I'm over here. So my question is, I've been doing freedom of speech stuff now for over 3 decades. And I find the hardest thing as we headed into the time period we're in right now is having to explain to young people why freedom of speech and why defending the written word includes defending the stuff that you don't like, includes defending the stuff that you would not necessarily want to read. It's very easy to defend the stuff that you would stand up for. How would you guys explain to kids now why you have to defend both sides of the coin?
I would start, I would do a little segment on Stalin show trials, because I'm a very old person. And I would do a segment on what happened during Mao's Cultural Revolution. And if you want, unfortunately the books about these things are quite long, but I can do some excerpts from them. This is what it's like when you don't have free speech. So do you want to live in a world, do you want to live in a place where there is no free speech and where a few people at the top decide what it is that the party line is? So this is acceptable, this you get shot. Sound like fun? No.
I mean, young people have, their moral imaginations have come alive with a series of issues that they feel very strongly about today, and do not feel that there is any place for an opinion or a point of view that is different from that. And I think that one of the ways that you can make inroads, Neil, with maybe somebody who you're speaking to with regards to this is to say that those very issues have found their way into the center of the discursive space. Maybe don't use discursive when talking to the kid, but
good advice.
Through the exercise of free speech. That it was free speech that made it possible for any of these conversations to actually be a conversation. And Frederick Douglass is a profoundly articulate defense of freedom of expression and the role that it plays in changing society. So I think that, you know, it's not seeing the forest for the trees. It's not really seeing that the big game, the game that they're all in on, is a game that was advanced and will continue to be advanced by free speech.
Yeah, I mean, we say that a lot at Penn, that, you know, whether your cause is women's rights or LGBTQ rights or climate justice, racial justice, immigrants justice, you need free speech protections in order to wage those movements, to mobilize people. Otherwise, you can be shut down. And, you know, it might be in this instance that the effort is to shut down something you disagree with or that you find hateful or objectionable. But once you give the authorities the power to do that silencing, they'll turn it against you and against a different cause. And you know, we do free speech workshops, increasingly institutes for young people, and we find they actually are quite persuadable. And part of it is having them talk to activists around the world who have been silenced, who've lived through it in Iran or China or Vietnam. That's incredibly powerful for them. So one thing I take heart from is that free speech is still inspiring to the next generation if they have a chance to be introduced to it.
Well, one of the things that the people in Ukraine say they are fighting for is free speech, because it is so notably absent from the world of Russia right now. And if Russia took over Ukraine, one of the things they were intending to do is destroy the Ukrainian language, just for example. And if that isn't the silencing of free speech, I don't know what is.
Yeah, absolutely. We've talked about it as a war of cultural erasure, that's what Putin's trying to do. Chimamanda?
So just to Neil's question about what should be done, I don't think the adults are doing enough. I think...
Doesn't think the adults are doing enough.
No, I don't. I mean, so there's so much talk about young people, but what... I mean, I consider myself an adult, relatively. And so I mean, mostly. But what are we doing? I mean, what I see, particularly in this country, right, in the US, is a kind of almost like an abdication of responsibility, where it's almost as though there's a fear to engage and challenge young people when they come up with the, often quite lovely, but, very enthusiastic and sometimes not right ideas about things. I really believe that, a bit more firmness, a bit more just seriously engaging with them and making the case. I don't think we make the case enough. And so we're told to learn from the young. I mean, this is a culture that just, there's, I think, a very unhealthy obsession with youth in this country. And I say this as a person who comes from, a culture that actually tolerates youth, but really venerates age. And when people say, listen to the young people, they'll teach you, I'm thinking, I remember when I was young. Like, I wouldn't want to listen to myself. Honestly, I just knew very little, but I thought I knew everything. And at the time, I appreciated, people who kind of knew a bit more, telling me things. And so I just think that we adults should do more. And so I'm really interested in engaging with young people rather than sort of backing away and being terrified that they're going to tell you that you're evil. And the other thing I think is that this is a culture that promotes performing goodness. Can we just not? Like, So it's so performative, and often it's very shallow and empty. But it's all. So what if we said to young people, you don't actually have to perform goodness. You can be good, but there's no reason to perform. And I don't want to go into a rant about social media because I think social media fuels so much of this. But I just want to say one last thing about voting, which is, and I know we're supposed to be. Are we supposed to be nonpartisan? Because I can't be.
You don't have to be. But we are.
We're all talking about vote. I care about people on the left because I just think the left makes more sense. And I think people on the left do not vote, and they need to get over themselves. And there's a kind of, so I remember, I cannot tell you how many educated, mostly academic types, who said to me, oh, Hillary Clinton is just as bad as Trump because she spoke at Goldman Sachs. And all kinds of nonsense, and they did not vote. And then Trump became president. And, now we're talking about abortion and how it might galvanize people, it might not. People on the left should not wait to be galvanized. They should bloody well vote. I really think that's the thing.
Free speech was originally in this country a left issue. It was an issue of the left, because it was those people who were in danger of being shut down. But the other thing I think that we have, quite a few of us as writers, that's good for speaking out, is that we don't have jobs. And we tend to, and therefore we can't be fired. And we forget that other people do have jobs, and maybe some of their reticence is if they did say some of those things, they'd get canned. So I don't think you can just forget about that, and therefore people who don't have jobs, it's incumbent on them to say the things that the people who do have jobs would like to say, but they're afraid to do it because there goes their rent money.
I'll say 2 sentences because I taught a high school class for 11 years, Neil, and I had kids from all over San Francisco, really different backgrounds, and a lot of, like Chimamanda was saying, like they unformed ideas about a lot of things. So things would be said in this highly liberal city that were not super enlightened, and there'd always be this moment of just like a gasp, like what's the penalty going to be? Is this student going to be cast out of our little basement where we used to meet? And never, of course, would they be cast out. Everything was allowed. We're still forming. Their brains are still forming. And every day of a kid's life in school, they should be told, you're going to hear ideas you do not like. 2, you're going to hear ideas that make you uncomfortable. 3, there's going to be people from every conceivable political party or background in this class, and they're going to stay. We're not necessarily going to convince them otherwise. And 4, we're going to treat each other and our opinions with respect. And if you can do that every day, and then you're going to listen to each other, and ideally, the better ideas are going to win out. You know what I mean? Over time, you're going to have rigor, you're going to have dialogue, you're going to have empathy, you're going to have a free exchange of ideas. But right now, there is a little bit of a chill where we wonder, like, did I say something that everyone's going to hate me forever for saying. And I think that we must keep that dialogue open and must make kids comfortable with discomfort.
And adults too.
And adults too.
I mean, sorry.
So once upon a time, we were raising money to do a pen congress in Toronto. And Graham toodles off to Conrad Black. And he says, you know, you got to give us some money for this conference on free speech. And he says, I'm not going to give you any money for that organization. It's full of communists. And Graham says, yeah, we do have some communists, but we've got some fascists too. and he got the money.
You got the money? All right. Take it from whence you can get it, I guess. All right, I have a good question here. Should we make a distinction between book bans that involve making any sale of a book illegal or prohibit publication on the one hand, and the removal of a book from a school library or a recommended book list for a school curriculum? The latter obviously isn't good, but doesn't make a book truly unavailable. And I guess, based on our own work on book bans, I want to add two dimensions to this that I think make it complicated. One is sometimes these bans really are about age appropriateness, and it's kind of a gating to say if you're under age X, this is not the right thing for you. And there's some books where you can kind of understand that maybe that would be the case, that something would be hard to understand or people might not be ready for it. The other thing is, what role do communities play in this? Our education system is very localized. Things are different in Brooklyn than they are in Boise. And we accept that, as a country, that school boards should be able to have a say, administrators, teachers, librarians in each place. And yet that can also open the door to censorship where individuals who don't fit what that community, how that community sort of sees itself, can feel completely alone in the way that Jenny described. So how do we think about all this?
Yeah, well, if you have to commit one of two sins, I'd much rather have a book available in a library for someone who's not old enough to read it than to have a book unavailable at all. I mean, it's I'm a parent. It would not be great to have a young child read, I don't know, there are books that you don't want, that you're not ready for, I guess. But I would rather have a child read a book too soon than not be able to read at all.
I read Peyton Place at a highly inappropriate age. On top of the garage roof.
Look how you turned out.
Nobody would, I know. Yeah, that's what did it.
Exactly.
Yeah, and guess what was in it that I was just really not ready for? Varicose veins were in it. Who knew about them?
But they're afraid that they'll get ideas like you did, Margaret. That's
that's it. I mean, it just ruined me.
Well, there was the Supreme Court case, Pico, protects books in the library. You can't remove a book from a school library just because of some objectionable material in it. And then you go back to the obscenity trial of Ulysses. And so if a book has literary merit, and if it just has a little bits of so-called inappropriate material, you cannot remove it from the library just by somebody thinking that it's offends them. But what we have right now, and what you guys have documented so well, is that 98%, I think you have, of the book bans right now have gone through no due process. So they have processes on the books that say how you have to remove a book. They're not going through any of those processes. They're saying temporary this, blah, 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 blah. And then in my case, in this Rapid City, just 2 weeks ago, the books they had all been removed, put in a warehouse until we knew more about how to deal with it or how they were going to deal with it. 2 weeks ago, the books somehow disappeared. So they're gone, and they're either in a landfill somewhere or they're at Mar-a-Lago. We do not know. But they're gone, and no process, legal or, district-wise, nothing was observed.
What city is this?
Rapid City, South Dakota. A really great town, by the way. It's in the shadow of Mount Rushmore. So.
Yeah, the processes you're talking about are things like requiring that somebody read the book before it's banned.
Right.
Yeah. I think you should make some samizdat, you know, prohibited list of prohibited books. Yeah. And they should be kept under the counter in the pharmacy, as condoms used to be. And you should be able to go in and say, "Can I see the list of prohibited books?" And then you have a whisper campaign. These are highly inflammatory books. Sales will go up.
Well, we made all these 5 books that were banned available for free to any high schoolers at the local bookstore. So we sold far more at the local bookstore for free to the high schoolers than they would have been, than would have read them otherwise. So, and is Art Spiegelman around here? Yeah. Yes. So sorry. More people got to mouse because of that. Art said they were the shrewdest marketers that he could have ever had.
Books were being airlifted in by people I had no use for, you know, that were seeing this as a great tool for, I don't know, Zionist support of Israel, and that they had to get the books there for free. So it's been very effective. And there is a distinction between books not being available and books being taken out of a curriculum. My point was, when I was having this conversation with people in McMinn, was far better to have this done in a curriculum, because I don't care if a kid is going to read the Turner Diaries, but much better that rather than get it off his dad's shelf, he has to discuss it with perspective, or that's true of Mein Kampf as well. And at which point, the teacher can really deal with stuff that's supposedly not age appropriate. It's just we have to pay teachers better and have them able to do that kind of work.
There we are.
Closing thoughts?
I'll build on Art's and then I'll shut up. But what happens, and there are probably some teachers in the audience, what happened in Rapid City, what happens in districts, and what's going on. We have a teacher shortage around the country. Every day they make teachers' lives harder from a new angle, whether it's untenable salaries, whether it's these new gag orders and curriculum oversight and transparency laws that tell teachers what to say and do every single day, and now these book bans where they empower the teachers to make an assignment, to assign books, and then they pull them, and then they have to redo their curriculum at the last minute. What happens is teachers quit. Teachers don't go into the profession in the first place. It's becoming less and less appealing. And then districts have a massive teacher shortage, and they're taught by, and so many kids I know right now are being taught by retired teachers coming back or not, people without degrees. Or they go to greener pastures. Teachers move to a district where they're given freedom. But it is an incredible crisis, and it starts with, or a major component of it, are these book bans and this feeling that the school board and other people that aren't, that often don't even have kids in the district have a say in what the teachers do. We have to respect teachers, give them the creative freedom that they have earned and deserve. That's the only way that the school system is going to be viable. Otherwise, it's the disaster that we often deal with when we don't treat teachers right.
Right.
Chimamanda, I'm going to give you the last word, I think.
No, I was just going to say we should also not expect teachers to know how to shoot guns.
No. Okay. So please give another round of applause for our distinguished guests. Thank you to everyone here for your steadfast support of PEN America and your ongoing contributions to the world of literature and the fight to defend the freedom to write here and around the world. I'd ask for just one thing, which is that when we reach out in the coming days and weeks, please answer our email, take our call, renew your membership, sign our petition. We could not do it without you, and as we rocket into our next century, we need you by our side. I want to give special thanks to Ayad Akhtar for his leadership at this momentous time. He's an extraordinary partner. Thank you to our trustees and our exceptional staff that never shrink from a challenge. A special shout out to PEN America's COO, Drew Menaker, for her indispensable role in our centenary. Our first meeting here at the Historical Society was in January 2020. There were untold twists and turns along the way, but Drew never faltered and has her hand in everything we do well. Thank you to Clarice Rosage Sharif and our Crackerjack Literary Programs team for masterminding this symposium, and to Deborah Wilson and our development team for making today so special. I want to recognize our trustee, Bridget Coleman, for her visionary curation of PEN America 100, A Century of Defending the Written Word with Lisa Kulisek. The exhibit will be open through October 9th, so tell your friends, make sure they come through. And then finally, a thank you to the Historical Society for their collaboration, and to all of our supporters, partners, and members of PEN America who are in this room and watching online from across the country. The centenary celebration continues. Please mark your calendars with the dates included in your program. This Wednesday, September 14th, will mark the launch of Speech Itself, a powerful new series of light projections by the renowned artist Jenny Holzer that will illuminate 3 buildings in Manhattan's iconic Rockefeller Center during 5 consecutive nights. The inspiration for Speech Itself was Bridget Coleman's notion that PEN America's legacy could not just live in a museum, but needed to be out on the street and among the people. Jenny Holzer has made that happen in a monumental and riveting way for all of New York and the world to see. So please make a point of coming down to Rockefeller Center one evening between Wednesday and Sunday to see it for yourself. In closing, here is a sneak peek of Speech Itself by Jenny Holzer. Thank you all for coming. You can get the idea, but please feel free you can file out, but please come see it live. It's going to be absolutely extraordinary, and I think you get a feel for that. Thanks so much.